such a blessing.
I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you in the next few minutes about giving up your fear of failure. You know, in life, we so often want to succeed. We so often want those around us to be a success. And from our early beginnings, we're taught that failure is something that we should avoid at all costs. And as we raise our children and bring them up, we create within them the idea that we must never fail and that we must succeed and that we must be conquerors and attainers in all things. And certainly there is a place for success and there is a place for overcoming. But in all of our lives, there are going to be times when we fail in any given situation. And I think we need to examine some of the ideas and thoughts that we have held near and dear to our hearts. And we need to be aware and be welcoming to the reality that some things come into our life for reasons that we may not understand. And so because of that, I'd like to invite you to give some thought to giving up your fear and giving up the fear that you have for those around you of failure. In our movement, we define fear as false evidence appearing real, F-E-A-R, false evidence appearing real. Fears in our lives tend to paralyze us, and the things that we're afraid of, the things that we are fearful of, so often are things that are going to come in the future, or they may be things that have happened in the past and we believe that they're going to occur again in the future. But this fear creates within us an immobility and an inability to deal with circumstances and situations. And regardless of what happens in our life, we need to be able to deal with what's happened. We need to be able to think about it. We need to be able to be guided and directed. And as spiritual people, we know that the essence of God, the essence of the infinite power of intelligence and love, reaches out to us and sustains us and guides us. And because of that, it is our faith, regardless of what your religion is, it is our faith in the reality of God that overcomes, should and must overcome the fear that we have. And that is fearing that something is going to befall us that we're not going to be able to deal with. And when we add fear to a fear of failure, we add two very negative powers and influences in our life. And as we instruct our children to avoid failure and to fear it, and as we do it for ourselves, and as we enter into that thought process, then the power of our mind moves into that fear mentality and modality, and it freezes or paralyzes us. And then the fear of failure creates for us an absolute frozen state whenever we are faced with a failure in life. You know, in reality, when we fail in anything, whether it's failing in a competition or a sport, or we fail in a job, or we fail to be able to accomplish something that we wanted or attempted to accomplish or to do in our lives, all that that means is that there's another way to go. It means that something has come to an end. We've come to a juncture in our life, and it is now time to make a decision. And the decision that we can always make is to be frozen in the fear of the circumstance or situation, or allow the circumstance or situation to empower us and guide us and direct us to different action, to a different way of thinking. Failure teaches us that there's another way to go, and it teaches us another way to grow. If you look back on your life, every time that you failed, you have gained something immeasurable, because each time that you have failed, you have been shown that there's another way. You have been forced to come to grips with the reality that something has come to a point in time and the outcome has not been the way that you wanted it to be. But life didn't end. Your thought process branched off or changed at that moment. And so each failure allows us to know that we can go another way. It teaches us that we can grow in another way. The other thing that failure does in our life, among other many, many positive things, failure creates for us, and the failings of our life, the little failings and the major, big, cataclysmic failings in our life, gives us a library upon which we can draw and have life experiences to make decisions in the future. You know, a library is filled with shelves and shelves of books, and those books give us information and give us guidance. Each failure in your life and in my life has created and is creating for us another volume on another shelf in the library of life. And it allows us to take that information down, to take it off the shelf, and to look at it when a new or similar circumstance presents itself in our lives. If we're going to deal in a positive way with failure, and if we're going to overcome the fear that we have of failure, we need to surround ourselves with positive, supportive people. And positive, supportive people allow us to make failures, allow us to make mistakes, and allow us in our failure to redirect, regroup, and to move our life again in a new or different way. But if all of the people in our lives are negative, if all of the conversation that we have is negative, if everybody that we're around avoids failure and sees it as some horrible and terrible event in our lives, then our thought process begins to embrace that which is surrounding us. And we think and we talk and we behave like the people around us. And so if you find your life involved with a lot of people, or if in your family circle there is a lot of negativity about failure, then I would invite you to re-examine the people around your life, and if it's in your household, to re-examine the way that people are thinking, acting, and reacting within your household or your family circle, and decide whether or not it isn't time to think differently about failure. Failures can strengthen us, they can direct us, and they can teach us. And one of the things that we believe in New Thought is that life is a school of the soul. You and I live for the single and sole purpose of refining and strengthening and growing in our soul and in our inner being. And so it is the difficulties of life, and sometimes even the failures and hurts of life, that teach us the greatest lessons. And since life is a learning experience, the failures that you experience and the failures that your children experience, the failures that we all encounter in life create for us learning experiences and make for us the positive experience that the negative of failure and the negative of fear can become. We live in our minds and not in the world. That means that the way that we think about circumstances and situations, the way that we think about ideas and concepts, determine how it is we view life. And if you view life in a negative way, if you view life in a fear of failure, if you see failure as an abject defeat, and you are so deflated that you are unable to recover, I'd invite you to examine your way of thinking. And perhaps it's time for you to embrace a new and more positive way of thinking. You know, so often we think that if we don't have enough money, we failed. If our children don't behave in the way that we think they should, we failed. If life doesn't go the way that we think it should go, we have failed. But in truth, life is not always the way we think it ought to be. It is simply the way it is. And if we begin to deal with an understanding and a realization that life is just a series of experiences, and that life is teaching us something that we need to come to know, then all of the failures and the hurts and the difficulties of life can become positive and uplifting. We live in our minds and not in the world. So I invite you to give up your fear of failure. We'd like to pause at this point in the program for a moment of prayer and a moment of reflection. Eternal and loving God, we gather our hearts and minds together in the release of fear and failure, and we embrace the concepts of learning through the experiences of life, and we welcome failure as opportunities to grow and to come to know you better. We ask and pray these things in the name of faith, in the name of hope, in the name of love. Amen.
Well, that was a wonderful reminder that we need to concentrate on the positive. And very often when we're fearing failure, we're thinking, what will other people think? We're not living from our own higher consciousness. We're living from that fear of what will other people think.
And that fear paralyzes us.
Yeah.
And the paralyzing is really the thing that is most damaging, because then we can't move.
Yes, as you said so well, frozen by fear. And it does freeze us. That's what happens with public speakers so often. They don't know what to say next, and so they're frozen with fear. We're in front of an automobile that's moving, and we're frozen with fear, and sometimes we don't get to jump because we're frozen.
And that fear really overtakes us and becomes such a preoccupation. And I think that when we add fear to failure,
Yeah.
it's really a damaging
Yes.
situation.
But don't you think that that's more because we think, what will other people think when we're fearing failure? We're thinking, what will other people think, instead of living in the now, which you teach so well. Live in the now. If we're living in the now, we're not afraid of failure because we're living right now.
And we're living honestly.
Yes.
And if we fail honestly, well, even if we fail dishonestly,
Yes.
we're all going to have experiences in life where we're going to fail. And I think that we kid ourselves and we set unrealistic expectations for others when we have such a high premium on success.
Yeah.
And we never, or we choose not to acknowledge a failure in life. And failures, of course, don't have to be the end.
That's right. Very often they can be the turning point. It's like God never closes a door, but he opens a window. We need to change our course. And the only way we can be changed is through failure of that endeavor in order to get on with the new thing that we're supposed to be doing anyway.
A failed business invites us, we can either be paralyzed and never go into business again. A failed relationship, so often people fail in relationship and then they're hesitant to go back, or they condition themselves to believe that the next relationship will be exactly like the last one. And of course, what psychologists tell us so often is that we do exactly that. We create another relationship that has the same flaws and the same faults that the first or the earlier relationship had.
Yes, and we've all seen that in people we counsel, that has happened over and over to them. And so it's no wonder that it does, because as you said, they create that reality.
And as they create that, they go deeper into it, and then they share it with others.
Yeah.
And so the entire aspect of life becomes negative.
It just strengthens the failure and strengthens the negativity in their lives. And we don't have to look on everything that doesn't turn out the way we hoped it would as being a failure either. It can just be a learning experience that we need to get on in a different direction.
That's very important, because so often we, again, going back to what people will think, we decide what it is we want to see happen. We decide what a successful business is or what a successful relationship is. And very often our ideas are wrong.
Yes.
And we need to fail. And it's the failure of ourselves in those relationships or circumstances that wake us up to the fact that there's a different way.
Yes, and what will other people think is such a terrible thing in our lives, because it holds us back. It keeps us from realizing our own fullest potential. And I'm from the Midwest, or farther east than the Midwest, and I think that people back there are more apt to think that way than people who live here on the West Coast.
I think West Coast people, and of course it's bad to stereotype, and so we're probably walking down a dangerous road here.
Yes.
But I think here in the West, we are very status conscious about what people think. I think that in other areas of the country and perhaps in other generations, people were concerned about what others would think about them in terms of their moral behavior. And I think there's some of that today, but much more concerned about what people will think of us as being successful.
Yes.
And so that idea that people will think badly of us does hurt, and it's part of the competitive nature that we have.
Yes, it is. But I think that we need to not think what do other people think, but just live to their highest potential and our highest ability, and then people are going to think well of us, and we don't. But we put our own preconceived idea on what other people think, and there's where the problem lies, in that fallacy. Because if I think, well, what will other people think, and judge and do my whatever I do according to that rule, well, I don't know what other people think. What I think they think might have nothing to do with what they're really thinking. So I'm putting a preconceived idea on what other people are thinking, and then it really gets me into a lot of trouble, and I think that's the biggest problem of all.
And of course, that preconceived idea of what other people are thinking is none of our business anyway.
Yes.
And so we're actually making judgments for other people that may or may not have any validity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you or some speaker said, what you're thinking, what you think of me is none of my business.
Oh, Terry Cole Whitaker.
Oh, that was Terry Cole Whitaker. Well, and that's very true, that we, just to be released from it.
And we need to. We need to be released from what others expect of us and what they think of us, and we need to behave the way that we think we need to behave and be open to the guidance of our own heart and mind in every circumstance.
Exactly, and I'd like to remind everyone that what we think other people think of us is often not what they're thinking at all. And we've seen that happen when we've thought people are just want something, when we want to please a guest in our home or a guest who's our guest at a meal. We want to please them. What we think would please them is often not what they really want at all. They want something else.
And so often it is exactly what you're saying. It's what we want.
Yes.
And so we want
Yes.
them to want what we want.
Yes.
And in that way, we continue to control them. And we deal with the way we think things ought to be.
Yes.
So.
And we're putting our own values on what we think other people are thinking. And that's not a good idea.
Yeah. Going back to the issue of failure, though, I think that there isn't a way that any of us are going to avoid having failures in life.
Exactly.
And we need to view it as a reality and as a part of life.
Yes. As you always say, we're all going to die. Eventually, our health is going to fail one way or another. And we're going to have people who will disappoint us in life, because there's not ever going to be any two people who are not ever going to disappoint each other. And we're going to be disappointed in our work, because that's the nature of things. So if we know that these things the change is inevitable, but we don't need failure. And then when failure comes, it's not failure, it's just a different direction.
It's guidance for a different direction. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about how often we want the people around us to behave in a certain way. If you're a school teacher, you want your students to behave in a certain way. If you have a family, you want your children, or people want their children to behave in a certain way. And if on a spiritual level, we think so often people should behave in a certain way, and yet they don't. And when we think about even Christ Jesus and the people that he chose, those in his inner circle, the 12, and yet they continue to fail him. And in their failure, we don't see him as the exemplifier and the way shower, pointing out their flaws.
Yes.
And we don't see him judging. And so often we judge because we think that, well, we've taught people thus and so why don't they behave accordingly? Well, here we had the greatest teacher of all time teaching spiritual truth, and the people didn't understand it to the extent that he wanted them to. And yet that wasn't a bother to him. I'm sure that he saw it as a failure in certain areas of his life, but it was simply the fact that that's the way it was, and it was accepted, and life went on.
Yes, and that great way shower never complained, and he never, as you said, was never critical of others. It was always positive living on that part. So we can take that as our guide and always just live to the highest without being judgmental of others, without judging circumstances at all, but just doing our best in the moment.
And he was absent fear. He was absent fear, and he was absent the fear of failure, because whatever happened was simply a part of life. And in our lives, all of these situations come and go, and they all meld into the wonder of who and what we are in such a positive way. And even the failures and the hurts of life are a part of that.
Yes, but if we realize that they're a necessary part of our growth, a necessary part of life, that there's no way we can live here on earth without having those happen, then we can bear them more easily. It's when we personalize and make it seem so that this is the only time this has ever happened to anyone, then that's when we get in trouble.
And that is more individualizing the situation and making ourselves more important than being a part of the whole.
That's an important aspect of putting ourselves on this high level that, that I'm so important and that everything happens to me. And why does this happen to me? It happens to whatever happens to one person has happened to millions of others and will to millions more.
We have a lady in the church whose husband passed away, and you know her, and she was concerned because he was an atheist. and yet he had such peace of spirit. And so often we think of people who are spiritual or religious as having a corner on the ability to understand truth and to live truth to the highest and the greatest extent of life. And yet, even though he didn't have a need for a spiritual dimension to his life, he was able to accept what was happening to him, that he had a terminal disease and that it was a very painful disease, and yet he bore it with such grace and with great dignity. And so it isn't even a religious faith that has to empower us and strengthen us as much as it's an attitude of mind and the fact that things happen to all of us.
Well, and two, it's that underlying core of spirituality within each person. They can either work with that underlying core of spirituality, or they can negate it. And if they work with it, then it wouldn't matter. The churchianity wouldn't matter. It's that they're living from the highest within.
And that's the key too. I think there's a difference, and we've probably talked about this before, between spirituality and religiosity.
Yes.
And so many people are religious, and yet they can't deal with failures and they can't deal with difficulties of life, and so they're lacking in a spiritual way.
Yes. I know a young lady who calls herself an atheist, but she's the least atheistic of anyone I've ever seen. She has great reverence and respect for our great way shower, the Lord Christ, and she's so non-judgmental of other people and loving to animals. She loves animals. Someone said, well, I think she likes animals better than she does people, and she doesn't, but she's very loving to animals and helpful to them. So whatever she wants to call herself, that's okay. It's just a name. But she doesn't have, she has no negative tendencies within her toward other people or the creatures.
So she is a very spiritual person.
She's a very spiritual person.
And whether she says it or not isn't important.
Exactly, exactly. And she was disappointed in a church situation when she was very young. And so then she just thinks all churches are not for her. No church is for her. But still, she's living with, as you said, with a spirituality predominant in her life. And this is what we all need to do. Our churches can sustain us. Some of us need church. We need to go to church at least once a week and be sustained. And I'm one of those. I've done that all my life, one church or another. And some people don't need that. And it doesn't matter. But we need to do whatever we need to do.
It's very true. And as we talk so often on this program, it doesn't matter for those that are listening to us whether they are of our faith tradition or of another faith tradition. The importance is that they understand the teaching.
Exactly. And I think the important thing, too, is that they have have some faith. Because if people don't have faith in some higher power, then when trouble does assail them, it's really hard for them to know how to act. It's really hard to go on. Where if they have faith in a higher power, then they're sustained. And we know from our own experiences, you and I and everyone who's hearing us, I'm sure can think back of times when if they didn't have faith in a higher power, they would have gone under.
And it isn't important what we call that power,
Yes.
or what we name it, or what we even say about it.
Yes. Yes, and the church, as you said earlier, that it doesn't matter what church people attend, but I think people overall would be happier if they do have a church home, if they do have a spiritual base, because when I'm putting my own projection on that, because that gives me greater strength and power.
Well, as Dr. Garlish, who founded our church, used to say, the church's primary role is fellowship.
Yeah.
So it provides a place where people of like minds come together and share their ideas.
Yeah.
And it isn't the church itself or the teaching that is as important as what goes on in the lives of the people in the church.
Well, and the worship service is a very important aspect, because as we worship God, we're tuning ourselves to that divine power within ourselves and God the whole, and aligning ourselves with that energy and power. So it does serve a very positive purpose, whatever the church may be.
It does, and especially for those who draw something from it.
Yeah.
Then there are others who, because of failures in the past and in a situation where a church or a faith tradition has failed someone, they sometimes are so injured or damaged by that they turn away from the church.
Yes, but just because one thing fails doesn't mean that everything's going to fail. And if we have one person who's sick in a family, it doesn't mean we don't take care of all those who are well.
And very important, I think, for us to talk a little bit about. Maybe it wouldn't be something that people would expect in a program like ours, but very often the church does fail.
Yes.
And many times priests and ministers and religious leaders fail. And in their failure, people are touched by that. And just because someone has had a bad experience with a religious leader or with a church or with a
Yes.
denomination doesn't mean that the entire movement is tainted.
Exactly. And it's just the person has failed. The church has not failed. The underlying concept of that church belief has not failed. But people fail. And people have failed from time immemorial and will continue failing. And when we put someone on a pedestal and put them in place of God and we worship that spiritual leader, then usually we're going to be disappointed.
And if the church itself becomes our God,
Yes.
which so often
Exactly.
people aren't able to differentiate between the two. And certain faith traditions do teach that the church is God's representative, and certainly churches are representative of beliefs and ideas in God, but the church, is, as we know it, is an institution.
Yes. Well, we've seen many churches fail in our time. And that Dana Carvey, who's on that TV show, he does a skit called The Church Lady, and it was so amusing. He's always amusing, and he does that one, and rightly so.
Yeah. And even if the church lady has failed, it doesn't mean that all churches are bad. It simply means that there's another way in another direction. Reverend Freelander and I have been talking with you about ideas of embracing and welcoming failure as an opportunity to overcome life. And we hope that you found this to be useful and look forward to seeing you next time.
Confident living, banner of might, comes from the Spirit with glorious light. Confident living cleanses my soul, giving the Spirit fullest control. Confident living rights every wrong. Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart. Confident living helps me expand visions of